All right, welcome everyone. So we're going to continue on our Vernadsky journey this week. We did three weeks going through the transition of the biosphere into the noosphere concept with a essay from 1938. We just finished that, and the link to those three readings are going to be in the description box to this video. Today, we're going to read The Evolution of Species and Living Matter, which was an appendix in Vernadsky's Biosphere, the book that he published in 1928. And what is very important, the reason why, Cynthia and myself, I think a lot of people have noticed that in our writings, we're often harping very much on this idea of the battle over open versus closed systems, as far as a clash over ideas that goes back a very long time over whether human beings exist as an animal or an animal-like machine to be programmed by a master class of programmers within a system of fixed resources to be controlled as a system. And because it's closed, the idea would be that it's all the energy that is available at one time is all that ever could be available. And then it just becomes a question of who will control the rules that shape the behavior of the system as it goes through a tendency of diminishing returns to a point of complete stasis, a breakdown, a heat death. This type of closed system view has been not just applied to human economy, but it's been applied to the whole biosphere. There's whole theories that premise the idea that you can measure and create ecological policy around this notion of a fixed, what's called static equilibrium or homeostasis as a natural assumed state of existence of the whole biosphere. But a lot of these pseudoscientists go even further, and they try to extend it to the entire universe. And this is where we get a lot of the ideas of modern cosmology, quantum mechanics, that tries to assert that, we have an ultimate heat death, which is controlling and pulling us into the future. And, that this heat death, this point where nothing really new ever happens again, is sort of the end of history of the universe. Sort of the Samuel P. or no, the Francis Fukuyama cosmology. And this also has its corollary that there was thus a point in time at the very beginning of a universe on a timeline, let's say about 13 billion years ago, they say, at which point nothing existed. There was just a void, a vacuum of infinite nothingness, and then something happened, and that something, which you could call Big Bang or whatever, was just the mystical creation of everything. That's just been sort of propelling us into this future heat death. So all that to say, this closed system idea doesn't have a lot of correlation with the observable phenomenon of the universe. It doesn't account for how we have a discoverable harmony, purpose within the organization of planetary bodies, within the organization of atomic behavior, within the periodic table of chemical elements, or within the overall growth of self-improved systems of species within the biosphere. And Vernadsky is a really wonderful remedy to this. And I had first encountered Vernadsky's name when I had been reading some of the works by Lyndon LaRouche, the American economist, who made a strong point for many years that Vernadsky's mind and his insights provide us a gateway into not only refuting the Malthusians today, and ultimately the Neo-Darwinians, who are also sort of the same thing, but they provide us also a gateway into thinking about the mind and processes like life as universal geological forces. So geological forces on the earth, but that are of a universal character, not just an earth-based character. So it's a very interesting idea. And this is a really wonderful sort of intro into what Vernadsky was creating as a new school of biogeochemistry. We will read probably just a few pages today. And I think anytime we want to stop, there's a lot of dense material. Just feel free to say, let's just ask a question, have a quick little side dialogue after various sections if they're needed. So I'm going to do a screen share. Can everyone see the screen in front of them?
Yep.
Great. And this was published in 21st Century Science and Technology and translated by Meagan Rouillard. So here, who would like to be, I know there's a couple of new faces here. If people are not necessarily comfortable reading live and you'd rather just listen and maybe be part of the dialogue afterwards, that's okay. But who would like to start off the reading today? Cynthia, you want to do it, or?
Sure. This is a new paper we're starting? Sorry, I wasn't there for the other ones.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it is.
Okay. From the introduction to the French translation, The Biosphere, written by Vladimir Vernadsky. This book appeared in Russian in 1926. The French translation has been reviewed and in several instances restructured comparatively with the Russian text. It followed our essay on geochemistry published in the same collection in 1924, of which a Russian translation just appeared and of which a German translation will soon appear. We will not give any bibliographic indications as they can be found in our geochemistry. We have touched upon the same problems in various articles, of which the most important appeared in French in the Revue Générale des Sciences and in the Bulletin de l'Académie des Sciences de Leningrad. The purpose of this book is to draw the attention of the naturalists, geologists, and above all, that of the biologists, to the importance of the quantitative study of life in its indissoluble relationships with the chemical phenomena of the planet. We have tried to constantly stay on the empirical terrain without making hypotheses, a terrain which is still somewhat restricted because of the small number of observations and precise quantitative experiments which we had at our disposal. It is essential at the present time to assemble in the shortest amount of time the greatest number of quantitative empirical facts. We cannot delay in trying to succeed in doing that. That is, only as soon as the great significance of the biosphere for living phenomena becomes clear. Maybe this essay, whose purpose is to shed light upon this significance, will not go unnoticed. I attach as an appendix to the French translation my speech, The Evolution of Species and Living Matter, which seems to me to supplement the ideas established in the Biosphere. Vladimir Vernadsky, December 1928. The Evolution of Species and Living Matter. Number 1. Life constitutes an integral part of the mechanism of the biosphere. It is that which clearly stands out in the study of the geochemical history of the history of the chemical elements. Biogeochemical processes, so important, always require the intervention of life. These biogeochemical manifestations of life constitute an ensemble of living processes, absolutely distinct upon first view from those studied by biology. It still seems that there is an incompatibility between these two aspects of life, between its biological aspect and its geochemical aspect, and only a more profound analysis allows us to recognize the character of this difference. It forces us to see that it is in part a question of identical phenomena which manifest themselves diversely, and in part of living phenomena which are effectively different and considered differently. That is, either from the point of view of geochemistry or, on the contrary, from that of biology. The comparison of these two points of view transforms the scientific conception of the phenomena of life are you at the top?
Sorry, yep.
And gives more depth to it. The difference between these two representations of life manifests itself in a particularly striking manner in the fact that the theory of evolution, which permeates the entire current biological conception of the universe, plays no role in geochemistry. Here we will strive to shed light on the importance of the phenomena of the evolution of species in the mechanism of the biosphere. From that standpoint, it is easy to convince oneself that the fundamental conceptions of biology must be submitted to radical modifications. The species is habitually considered in biology from a geometrical point of view. The form, the morphological characteristics are primary in terms of importance. In biogeochemical phenomena, on the contrary, this is reserved to the number, and species is considered from an arithmetic point of view. Different species of animals and plants must be, in the manner of chemical and physical phenomena, composed of chemical compounds and physico-chemical systems, which are to be characterized and determined in geochemistry by numerical constants. The morphological indicators which have been taken up by the biologists and which are necessary for the determination of the species are replaced by numerical constants. In biogeochemical processes, it is indispensable to take into consideration the following numerical constants: the mean weight of the organism, its mean elementary chemical composition, and its mean geochemical energy. That is to say, the facility with which it produces displacements, otherwise called the migration of chemical elements in the living environment.
Okay, there's a lot of concepts here, and I don't want people to get too intimidated by some of the ideas that are being unveiled, because it's a lot more elementary than you realize. It seems like we've just like jumped into the deep waters with sharks. I guarantee you, it's not the case. It's and it'll become more clear as you go through it. But Vernadsky, I think one thing I should have said is he's dealing with a twofold battle. On the one hand, you have the Darwinians with their materialistic view of trying to conceptualize a biosphere from the standpoint of a bottom-up approach, that each species is at war with all other species, and there's a tension caused by the lack of resources to go around, which creates that tension is the basis upon which a mechanism of random mutations occurs that generates certain qualities like bigger claws, faster legs, or whatever, that give an edge to one species to beat out, to destroy its competitors, right? And mate more, have more food. So it all kind of reduces down to something libido driven to spread the genetic makeup into the future. But it's still a very bottom up view of building up a system as a whole, which is the sum of its parts. The opposing network or field, which Vernadsky is also doing battle with, are the vitalists, those who are simply trying to say in a sort of brain dead way that there is just this élan vital, this spiritual force pulling things teleologically in a certain direction without really much regard for the actual principles that are discoverable. So they tend to get a little bit, this school tends to get obsessed with the forest, and they don't care so much about the trees and the details. The Darwinian school tends to think only about the trees and the details, and they lose sight very easily of the forest. So it's these two false paths, right? And Vernadsky is trying to intervene on both by saying there's virtues in both, by having the discipline to try to find the numeric constants. That's good to do that, to try, you don't want to skip those steps. You want to, but at the same time, you want to have a sense of the whole, and you want to have a sense of directionality. So the idea of uniting, he's like, you can't know biology if you don't also look at the geology that is being shaped and which shapes the existence of living matter. And you can't look at either one properly unless you also take into consideration how chemistry is also a part of the mix, right? And there's certain chemical elements that move through the biosphere, as we went through in our previous essay, right? There's certain carbon, there's certain isotopes which pass through the living systems, and a lot of things on the periodic table of 92 natural elements that are not absorbed very much by living matter. uranium and thorium and these things, they don't really play a role so much in living systems over time. But things like nitrogen do, calcium does. So there are some elements that are absorbed, that are brought through the biosphere, through leaves, through photosynthesis, chlorophyll, life when we eat and when we excrete, that is sort of like cycling through. And so he's saying these cycles give us certain constants that we can relatively measure as far as like an average amount of, processing bias. He says here, the mean weight of individuals within a species. What about the species as a whole? What about the geochemical energy, right, of one species that might process atoms or molecules faster or slower than another species? These are things that are relatively measurable. So most scientists haven't done the work. We just don't know. We know that it's doable, but we haven't done the work to build up an infrastructure of the mind to look at the biosphere in that way, as a process that is trying to create more free energy. And that energy is going to be something which is going to allow for an ever greater degree of creative change. And that was sort of more of a focus in the previous essay, but he's going to get at that in this essay as well. I don't know if there's any other questions or not, but I think that was just an important point to just get across.
Where's Warfield? I can hear him.
Warfield is whining to go outside. Should I let him outside?
I don't know. I thought he was like trapped in a closet or something.
No,
okay.
Yeah.
That's
our cat.
Sorry, yeah, not a person. In biogeochemical processes, it is matter and energy which are primary instead of the inherent form of the species. The species can, from this point of view, be considered as a material analogous to the Earth's crust, as waters, minerals, and rocks, which for the organisms are the object of biogeochemical processes. Seen from this angle, the species of the biologists can be envisaged as living homogeneous matter characterized by mass, elementary chemical composition, and geochemical energy. Normally, the characteristics of species are expressed by numbers informed by weight, chemical composition, and speeds of transmissions of geochemical energy, but these do not give anything but an abstract and very obscure idea of the reality. It is possible to replace this idea with another, which relates more clearly to the character of the natural process which creates the organism. In this domain, we may take the point of view of physical chemistry and consider the organisms as autonomous fields which determined atoms in determined amounts are reunited. This quantity constitutes precisely the characteristic property of each organism and each species. It indicates the number of atoms that the organism of a given species can retain due to its force outside of the field of the biosphere, atoms which are drawn thus from the ambient environment. The volume of the organism and the number of atoms which compose it, expressed numerically, give the most abstract formula, but at the same time, the most real measurement of how the species is reflected in the geological processes of the planet. We obtain this formula in measuring the size of the organism, its weight, and chemical composition. This number of atoms and the volume of the organism thus determined are indubitably characteristics of the species. The presence of life in a sphere of determined volume with the concentration of a certain quantity of atoms constitutes a real phenomenon of nature, as characteristic for an organism as its form or physiological functions. Fundamentally, this idea probably expresses with the greatest depth the essential traits of its existence. The numbers obtained are very considerable. For example, concerning the lemna minor, the number of atoms for an organism is greater than 3.7 to 10 to the 20th and reaches the hundreds of quintillions. These great numbers.
One second. What is the? Oh, duckweed. Okay, that's another way of saying duckweed. So that's a relative. These are not obviously the exact numerical number of the atoms involved with, all of the organisms of duckweed that exist in the world. It's a basic, he's doing these general relative quantities, right, to indicate the general volume. So you will never know the exact mathematical number because it's always changing. And how are you going to do a proper, like, full-blown assessment, right? An audit, you can't do that. But just to get across, that's the mathematicians who are very, like, obsessively for just measuring and weighing everything, right? They call them often the positivists. The positivist school says that the only reality is the reality that can be weighed directly by the five senses and charted and mathematized. And anything outside of that can't be done that way has no claim to reality. Whereas the more healthy school of real scientists would acknowledge that from the get-go, mathematics is a useful tool, but it's not a pathway to understanding reality. Reality is something we start first with a general idea, right, of an insight, and then the math can guide us or help us in that pursuit. So just to get across, he's not a quantity, he's not trying to say the nature of species is quantity per se. It's just it's an attribute, but an important attribute if looked at the right way.
These great numbers correspond to reality and lend themselves to numerical comparisons between the different species. This determination of the species according to the number of atoms comprised in the volume occupied by the organism only deals with the more customary biological characteristic of the species, which does not take into account the form and the structure. The homogeneous living matter of geochemistry and the species of biology are identical, but the modes of expression are different. Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Or I know there's a lot, so you don't necessarily have a question, that's okay, but anybody have a thought or a question that they would like to share?
I do. When you talk about geochemistry and biology, like geology, I think of rocks and crystals and the chemical makeup of that, and biology, the same. Okay, chemical makeup of that. Modes of expression are different because biology. Why are they different? Why is, like, so living mass matter, green matter biology, right? Generally, in living beings too. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, because there's things that are similar and things that are different. The question that Vernadsky, you're going to find the language he often uses when describing biological phenomenon. He will often make a point to use living matter as a term, as distinct from life as a principle. Now, when he does that, I think it's useful because he's just getting across that when you're looking at a living thing, like we're all living organisms, right? We're not looking at life per se. We're looking at a manifestation of life. And if we had a dead corpse, that we were looking at, and that just died a few minutes ago, and you compare that corpse to when it was still alive a few minutes earlier, it's made up of very similar, atoms, molecules, the weight's pretty much the same. So the difference is that there's something not animating the dead corpse that was animating the live one, the live body.
One's animated, one's not. One's animated and one is not. Is that the difference?
Well, one is, and what do you guys think? I mean, yeah, what would be the thing animating? What would be the type of behavior we could expect to see in the atoms and the molecules within the living being?
Well, have you gone through the example of Pasteur's chirality?
Well, that's a leap. You can take that leap if you want.
No.
I mean,
well, I mean, it's just interesting as well that you find in nature the chirality. So whether it's apparently turning towards the left or to the right, its structure, it will correspond to the kind of function it has. So you have instances in nature where, for instance, one chirality could be a poison and the other chirality would be completely safe for you to consume. I don't remember the specific, substance that this was referring to. And then was it, Matt, I'm a little bit rough with my memory. One was like a living process as well, and one was not a living process. Was that correct?
Yeah.
Or another example?
Yes, another example that one chirality would be an orange and the other one would be a lemon.
It's the same molecule in a sense.
Yes.
But when the molecule is organized, let's say like you have a glove, right? You could take a glove off your hand and turn it inside out. All of the arrangements of the fingers are the same, except that you can't fit it back on the same hand if it's inside out. So molecules can organize themselves in sort of like a mirror image. And the weird thing is that though they're quantitatively the same molecules, right, in both cases, when you look at the qualitative attributes of that same molecule as a mirror image, it'll be like Kwan just said, in the case of like orange, it's the same molecule that will give off a lemony taste if it has a mirror image, or spearmint, and I think it's.
But technically, that also holds for the abiotic as well as the biotic, n'est-ce pas?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like arsenic is just like a bad version of another, I don't know what it is, but they're variations on the same, or chemical variations, I guess. But I had this simple idea of, pardon me?
I would like to introduce the idea of light, life, and matter, okay? Because chirality is coming from Greek care, meaning hands, okay? So you have dextrogere and levogere, okay? D is when that molecule would turn the polarized light to the right. And levogere, I'm sorry, I speak in French, levogere or L, is when that molecule would turn the polarized light to the left, okay? And what is interesting here is that, as Matt said in the beginning, Vernadsky tried to escape the obsessions of the Darwinians and of the vitalists, because he wanted to take into account form and numbers. And one of the major discoveries of modern molecular biology is precisely the 3D structure of molecules or of substances participating to living processes. And that D or L turning of the polarized light to the right or to the left is precisely an outstanding example of the first dimension, the form. And that form, how it interacts with light, it's very interesting, because I am not even sure that Vernadsky has the answer, or maybe when we will go deeper into his text, we will discover his answer. But there's something in light and life which are wedding together, if you want, okay? Because, and here I would take a risk to go into my deep proclivity of esotericism. You have consciousness, light, and life, okay? Because once again, Vernadsky tried to offer a model which is not Darwinian and which is not vitalist, okay? The vitalist will only focus on, well, that's the power of life, okay? And that's a very religious answer. And the Darwinian would offer a very mechanical answer. And Vernadsky tried to offer a more complex answer, taking into account the many layers.
Yeah.
I have a simple thought.
Yeah, Dave, go for it.
Well, I think of it in terms of action, right? Like there's certain actions transformative actions that life is able to perform. and I know elsewhere, Vernadsky's talked about like time, right? The time scales in which life develops and changes compared to the geological time scales, they're qualitatively different, right? They just happen on a qualitatively different level. If you put life in a certain environment, it's going to start transforming that environment. I mean, that's what Earth is, right? It was just first single cells, and they started collecting sunlight and growing and developing and becoming more complex, but they're achieving a qualitative rate of change that doesn't happen in abiotic matter. So there are specific characteristic actions that life is able to, or that suggests there's this principle called life that's able to do these things.
But the question is, like, how is it that you have, components that the abiotic and the biotic are made up of the same things, but one has life and one has non-life? Because you're describing that life has function, but that's the thing, is that what gives it that capability, even though it shares in the same kind of components?
Maybe the answer is in the word, the structure, because let's make the hypothesis that in abiotic components, the structure is rigid and not dynamic, okay? And in biotic components, the structure is capable of action, as Dave said, and that structure is precisely dynamic and not rigid. And here, maybe there's a role for light precisely, because let's not forget that one of the hypotheses why life appeared on Earth many billion years ago, it's because some bolt of lightning struck that primitive soup. Okay, I know that it's a very simple image, but in the bolt of lightning, you have light, you have heat, and you have energy.
Mm-hmm.
And why certain rocks, for example, would simply be broken by a bolt of lightning, and you would have 10 pieces of broken rocks, for example, okay? Nothing special would happen. But with other special matters, which structures are not so rigid that bolt of lightning giving heat, light, and energy would trigger some action, some mechanism.
There's
And it was like
definitely-
the first life forms. It was cyanobacteria, or no? Did it require photosynthesis?
No.
No. Amino acid was the first form of life, which is even more primitive than the cyanobacteria, because cyanobacteria in the hierarchy of life is relatively complex.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but that wasn't life. The amino acid isn't life, is it?
Well, the DNA is life, because life is what? Is something that can reproduce itself. And a virus, the only purpose of a virus, let's not talk of the COVID, but any virus, is to reproduce its RNA, okay? And it would infiltrate a more complex cell to reproduce its RNA. But there's a debate here. Some scientists would not accept viruses as life, okay? But some accept viruses as life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what's important about Vernadsky, what he's trying to do right now is sort of clarify the terms. So there's a clarification of terms that we take for granted, and he's sort of getting at how do we use the words, and what ideas do we have associated with words when we think about the system we're trying to understand of life as distinct from non-living, geochemical processes, and how does it interact? And I think we've just said a whole bunch of very useful things, really useful things in terms of how life transforms.
Mm-hmm.
It has this sort of tendency to transform its process of the external ambient environment and its internal environment, and also the question of light in life, and how life has this quality of rotating polarized light, and that's what Louis Pasteur was looking at, and many others, was how living organic material will always rotate a plane of polarized light, versus non-living material will not have that effect on polarized light. That also is something.
Once you have a chirality, you can't change it. It's like
chirality is a characteristic of living stuff.
Yep.
but you
Okay,
can't,
like the orange and the lemon.
Yeah.
because I just remember he was growing the crystals and he noticed that they were all growing in like one. So I was wondering if he could have induced a different
No,
chirality.
what he found, and I don't want to go on too much of a side note, but yeah, he was looking at the tartaric crystals that tend to form in mirror images, and they're not the same. It's not 50-50, but he'll find, like, he found that when he was looking at tartaric crystals that were forming, and he's doing work on wine, and he found that, using a magnifying glass, that you had ones that looked the same, but they were again configured in mirror images. And when he separated them arduously over hours and placed only the right-handed crystals in a water liquid solution, and then passed the polarized light through it, he found that by doing that, it caused the polarized light to rotate using, get a interferometer that allowed for the measurement of the rate of rotation of that light. And it would do the same thing with the right-handed crystals in another solution. It would rotate it in the other direction. But when they were all together, naturally occurring, there was no rotation of the light.
But
So
he didn't understand how the chirality was being produced. It just happened.
No, that's where we get into the world of metaphysical hypotheses, which he's saying before we go and jump into that world, we should really just take the time to look at what we can know. What are the specific attributes of living matter, of life's expression in matter, in as many ways as possible. And then when we have a good groundwork, we've done the work, then we can launch our minds into the realm of causality and hypothesizing causality. But he's like, don't skip steps.
I want to say one more thing too before we go further. I think that the light and life thing is definitely a very central theme, but it makes me think that there are things that have grown like in the deep ocean that have never been exposed to light, and yet there's life there. So it doesn't seem like it's an essential thing.
No, because even in the depth of the ocean, you have a photon energy capable to reach to the depth of the oceans.
Really?
Oh, absolutely, yes. You have some bacteria which don't need oxygen, okay? But it doesn't mean that there's no photonic energy reaching to the depth of the oceanic bed.
Okay, all right. I guess I'll keep reading. Unless you wanted to say something, Kwan?
No, not really. And well, I just want to say that Matt is absolutely right, okay? Because now we cannot create life, okay? In the sense that if chirality is a fundamental characteristic of life, we understand those things conceptually and we can measure those things, but we are not capable to create a substance having chiral properties, okay? Because if we're capable of that, we create life, which is not the case yet. Right. Okay, maybe I should not say yet. We will see.
Good point. I actually used to know that and then I forgot it because I haven't been looking at this stuff in a while. Okay, so I'll just keep reading. Number 2, the study of living phenomena in the mechanism of the biosphere shows differences which are still more essential among the ordinary biological notions. The biosphere in its fundamental traits has not changed in the course of geological epochs since the Archaeozoic, since at least 2 billion years ago. This structure reveals itself through a great number of corresponding phenomena, among them the biogeochemical phenomena. Thus, the geochemical cycles of the chemical elements seem to remain immutable in the course of geological time. The Cambrian should have the same character as the Quaternary epoch or that of our days. The conditions of climate, volcanic phenomena, and the chemical and physical phenomena of erosion have remained. in the course of all the geological epochs as we now observe them. In the course of the entire existence of the Earth until the appearance of civilized humanity, not a single new mineral was created. The mineral species on our planet have remained the same or were modified over time in an identical way. The same compounds as those of today have been formed for all time. In no case would we know how to relate a mineral species to a determined geological epoch. It is in this that the mineral species sharply distinguish themselves from living homogeneous matter, from species of living organisms. These latter modify themselves in a very marked way in the course of geological time. They spring forth and are always new, whereas the mineral species remain identical. Life considered from the geochemical standpoint as an element of the biosphere submitted to simple oscillations taken in its entirety appears as stable and immutable. Life constitutes an integral part of the geochemical cycles which unceasingly renew themselves but remain always identical, and it would not be able to undergo great changes in the course of phenomena studied by geochemistry. The mass of living matter, that is to say, the quantity of atoms captured by the innumerable autonomous fields of living matter, the mean chemical composition of the atoms of living fields must, in sum, remain invariable across geological periods.
Just want to see what that footnote is here. I'm just going to read that. I'm just curious. So it says here, 10 years after making this speech, Vernadsky had altered his formulation either due to new data available to him or perhaps a more ontological reason. And there's a quote here from his 1938 paper. The mass of living matter in the biosphere is close to the limit and evidently remains a relatively constant value on the scale of historical time. It is determined above all by the radiant energy of the sun falling on the biosphere and by the biogeochemical energy of the process of colonization of the planet. Evidently, the mass of living matter increases in the course of geological time, and the process of the occupation of the Earth's crust by living matter has not yet been completed. Yeah, okay, so we have these different time scales of historical time versus geological time. We're dealing with very different magnitudes here, right? So historical time being, as I understand it, human time as far as we measure history as a human phenomenon, geological time being something much broader than that. So in the context of, like, I think what I'm getting here is the historical time, there's a relative constancy. We don't see like new elements necessarily or new minerals or anything like that necessarily appearing. There's a constancy, but we do have, when we take a step back and look at the broader cycles, we do see a lot more of this change happening in some ways. I don't know if Vernadsky, I don't think he knew about the great extinction cycles, the cataclysmic periodic extinction cycles at this time. I think that was something he began only alluding to later on in his years. But he does get at the question of mass extinctions, but not in a cyclical way like we know of today, right? Like we know that there's been every 32 million years or so mass extinctions, or maybe these numbers are off. I see Marty shaking his head. Yes, these numbers are off. I'm aware of that. But we know that there are these periodicities of massive disasters caused by forces of nature. We don't fully understand. Some we do, some we don't. And then new sets of species come into being. When we look at the fossil records, we don't worry about the scalar times here, but we do know that there are these periodicities. Again, Vernadsky was, I don't think, fully aware early on when he was writing this about that. Marty. I can't hear you, Marty.
Is that okay, Matt? Is that better?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm obviously completely with you on mass extinctions in different eras. Darwin had as you know, had an absolute terror of this. Uniformitarianism was essential, and racism were both totally insupportable scientifically, but were imposed basically by the British Empire for its own peace of mind on the science of the whole world. But I would maintain it goes further. My old master Velikovsky in Worlds in Collision traces upheavals that we assume happened scores of thousands and millions and tens of millions of years ago to within the human historical record and are so recorded. There's a lot of work being done at the moment. It's very groundbreaking work, arguing that the maps of Claudius Ptolemy were not inaccurate. They were relatively accurate descriptions of the classical world before the upheavals that destroyed the Roman Empire. Now that's a very profound concept, and it's actually supported by the fact that we find Roman remains, Greek remains, remains of other civilizations around the world, that we know were only a few thousand years ago, buried beneath hundreds of feet of earth and geological upheaval. How could this happen? How could there be 300 drowned cities in the Mediterranean, which there are, unless the geology of the world changed rapidly, far more recently than even many catastrophists want to make out. Now, this is not to invalidate Vernadsky, on the contrary, but it's to say, again, he opens a door for us. And when we go through that door, it takes us much further than I think he could see it. But like the great visionary he was, but when you have the adaptability of life, there is a dialectic involved here, a dialectic against chaos. Whenever there is chaos, there is movement. And if I may just make one further point, Velikovsky predicted conditions which we have found in the last 50 years in hundreds of cases on the moon, Mars, Venus. He predicted water would be found in abundance under the surface of the moon and on Mars, which we now know to be the case. It appears to be buried within asteroids like Ceres and within at least 5 moons of Saturn or Jupiter as well. This is inconceivable in the conventional science of the 1950s or 60s, but where it fits in with Vernadsky is what you said, Matt, that when we have new species appearing dramatically in the fossil record, they are not just creation ad nihilum from nothing. And sometimes they are, very often they will be dramatic adaptations to different environments on the Earth. But there's another form or origin for them as well. They will actually come from other planets and from comets. The one point I'll add here is Francis Crick, who was one of the 2 deciphers of DNA, came to the conclusion, and he was an atheist, he had no conventional religious view at all, but he was convinced that DNA had to be created by some intellectual mathematical entity, that it had to be a product of some process of creation, because statistically, mathematically, it was impossible that this structure, which is not really binary, but is as you said, 3-dimensional, and has 4 key mathematical bases, that it could have come about even in trillions of years by chance. It could not have been by chance. And here again, Vernadsky comes out on top, and Darwin is exposed as bankrupt and fraudulent. The one last point I'll add is uniformitarianism is Darwin's cop-out. Darwin simply says, give us enough trillions of years, and my form of evolution, my brutalist form of evolution, will work. That's all you need. But we don't have unlimited trillions of years. That is not the geological record. It is not the astrophysical record. The astrophysical record shows that Vernadsky is right, but that change transforms with major agents on the Earth and from beyond the Earth. As you said, as Cynthia said, in much faster periods of time. Not only is life not slow and inert, the universe, for all its infinite size, is not slow or passive or inert either.
Well, this is where I like this. And I mean, yeah, I guess we're so close to the end of this little section here. But I'll just say one thing is that the interesting thing about Vernadsky is he's always looking at the change and no change, kind of like Plato is always looking at the being and the becoming. So what is changing in every process and what is constant? And the thing that one would ask as an astrobiologist from a Vernadskyan standpoint would be, well, okay, if life has these attributes, let's say of the golden section of rotating light here in this part of the solar system in our Milky Way where we happen to exist, would it also, and of course it would, have that same characteristic in another appearance in another star system or another galaxy even, right? Or would mind discover the doubling of the square differently if it arose in a different star system to ours? And probably we would find the similar character. We might find the physical attributes of sentient life being very different from what we are recognize here, right? Maybe the sun that whatever that tuned the organism's development in time in another star system might have a different spectrum to it, and maybe the eyes would not recognize what we see as visible light. That might not be the same thing, but we would have certain commonalities in terms of moving the mind in a creative, reasonable way, which would be common. So that's an interesting thought experiment as well, in a variety of ways. And also the idea of transforming light into action, light and heat into a process that drives metabolically a system towards increasing free energy. That would also likely be something we would find in life's manifestation on another celestial body in the heavens, not just here on the earth. So these constants are good to just map out and see how many we can pull together.
I'd like to add something here.
Yeah.
We're saying things like organic matter is the product of like living organisms. Who's to say that like inorganic matter isn't alive? Like we don't know that.
Well, I hear you.
Life could be like the living evolution of matter or something like that. That includes not just organic stuff, but inorganic as well.
Well, try a thought experiment. If you break a rock with a hammer, does it have the same effect on your conscience as breaking a puppy dog or your neighbor's head?
No, it doesn't. But on the same hand, like before, like life as we know it existed, there was the formation of elements. Maybe there was a life force behind, like even before organic matter was even here. Like it was a different.
Yeah. No, Kelly, Vernadsky would not disagree with you in the sense that he's always very careful to distinguish the life principle as distinct from living matter. So he doesn't want people conflating the two terms. Yeah, because in Vernadsky's mind, there is no such thing as emptiness or the void. That's an artificial abstraction humans created, the idea of emptiness. In Vernadsky's world, it's only pure substance. And of that substance, you could imagine that life as a principle could not exist anywhere, that there could not be imagined any volume of so-called space anywhere where there would be no expression of the life, not here, like right here, this empty area right here in front of me, the life principle could not be said to be absent from that space, right? And same thing for the question of the noetic quality of mind, of like creative reason, as another phase space, as Vernadsky calls the noosphere, right? The biosphere, the sphere organized by life, right? The noosphere, the space organized by thought, by reason, and the abiosphere, the space that is not animated by those things. But it doesn't mean that there is no presence of life. It's a distinction that's not a self-contradiction.
Yes, yeah, but I would, I would like to say that Vernadsky answer is a very traditional one, okay? Because according to traditions, Western tradition and Eastern traditions, life or consciousness is pervading all cosmos. And why, to go back to Matt's thought experiment, why we would feel bad using a hammer against a puppy or your neighbor instead of a rock? Because the life in the rock is not as complex as the life in the puppy or in your neighbors. So the notion of complexity will allow a hierarchy of life, okay? There's life in the rock, but not as complex as the life in the puppy or in the life in your neighbor, because the life principle is everywhere, okay? So the principle in the rock is not as developed or as complex as the life principle in the puppy or in your neighbors. So we go back to the notion of organization and of structure.
It's not enough for me, Kwan, though. I would, because what is complexity to you? Is I think of it as a quantitative idea, more and less complex. But what do you think of complexity when you say that word?
What are, for example, the human body, okay? You have many organs interrelated into something called the human body.
Mm-hmm.
Each organ is a living entity by itself, okay? Not counting the viruses and the bacteria which elected our body as their houses. So there's a universe in which there are much more communication, information, structure, interactions than in a rock, okay? Because in a rock, you have a crystalline structure, which is something moderately complex. But in a human person, body, you have many layers of organization, and you have many networks of communication between those layers of organization. And it's obviously much more complex than the crystalline structure of a diamond, for example, to take a noble rock.
But would it be the case that the simple increase, I agree with you, like obviously I agree with you that a biological organism is more complex than a rock. I agree with you. But is it enough to say that if we, like what if I were to say as a thought experiment, let's increase the complexity of the rock by 1,000-fold, 1,000,000-fold, and we'll make the rock more complex. And we'll increase the rate of intercommunication of the atoms within the rock. That still doesn't account for, like if I ran my mathematical models and it doesn't account for all of a sudden the appearance of a living organism as
no, because what do you mean by increasing the complexity in the rock? Increasing the number of atomic links, increasing the different chemical elements, rather than a rock of carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. You would add silicium, and because let's not forget that certain elements, when together, are more creative, if I may say so. Okay, you can have lattices of very complex crystalline structure that would remain rigid, okay, but would not have precisely that capability to create new groupings of geochemical elements.
Right. I got something as a quick example in how I'm thinking. Imagine if you took like a recording device and you went outside in traffic and you recorded all of the sounds and frequencies that you would get, and you recorded it, right? You'd get a wide spectrum of complex sounds, people yelling, you know, sell me newspaper, hot dogs, cars honking, all sorts of stuff, ambient sounds from the background. And then you have your very complex, very sensitive sound system picking all this up. And then you go in with a recording device, same one, and you record Mozart's Ninth Symphony. And you find that there's a lot of frequencies and sounds, but the organization of the sounds are very different. They both might be very complex, but I think
Yes, but here you are going back to Vernadsky answer, Matt, okay? We have the number and the form. certain form obeys to natural laws of harmony and complexity. Your example of random noises in the street imply great numbers of noises, okay? In the case of Symphony 40 or 41 by Mozart, for example, those noises or those sounds are organized according to some natural laws called the rules of musical composition, okay? And that is the principle of life if we go back to our initial discussion, okay? And that principle of life, which is present everywhere, needs the bricks, okay, needs the geochemical elements in different new groupings at higher level of complexities in order to manifest the higher lives, as the random noises are not the same than Symphony 41 by Mozart.
That's interesting. Can I just interject that this made me think that, you know, maybe it's just a difference in density because, and maybe then time, actually, maybe these different forms of life experience time differently. Say a rock being dense, very, very dense, time would be, I think, slowed down then. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that's why they're so still, and they are very complex actually. And they are libraries, rocks, and specific libraries. And so anyway, just wanted to mention that we don't really know. We're being kind of arrogant in a way by assuming that they're on the same time scale that we are on, aren't we?
Yeah, and I would like to go back to the first question by Kelly, okay? Because that's precisely one of the hypotheses of contemporary biology, than to say, at a certain level, we call certain things living matter, okay? But I'm not saying that it's the question, it's the answer, but I would like to say that for a very long time, since the beginning of mankind, tradition gave the answer that everything is alive, but not everything has the apparatus to express its aliveness at the same level. Okay, because once again, is it, and I don't pretend to have the answer, I have to be honest about that. Is it pure consciousness for everyone and more complexity to express the aliveness, or what we call atoms and molecules mixing together and going through a certain threshold, and that threshold would become life. Okay, that's the nexus of the discussion.
Isn't the term like noonosphere? That implies human involvement in the biosphere, like our brains, and we're like at the higher end of this evolutionary progress. Like, I think that's why he even made that term in the first place, isn't it? Noonosphere?
Noosphere.
Yes, noosphere. Yeah. And it would be quite interesting, because we would go from pure consciousness evolving to a species capable to reach to that noosphere.
The idea of space-time as well, as you brought up, Jolie, is very important, because yeah, you're not dealing with the same quality of space-time when you have, let's say, you can imagine the growth, the evolution of the periodic table, the Mendeleev table of elements. right, of the 92 at least naturally occurring elements, though one could say we'd probably find a lot more if we looked for them elsewhere. But we created a lot of the transuranics, plus the thousands of isotopes. But there's a certain rate of growth one could imagine that occurred in its own very, relatively slow pace, which we find all of a sudden very different when you're looking at the growth of living systems. There's like a new space-time we're entering now when you have a living system processing. You can compare it to the moon, which has a very low, either no or very low level expressions of living matter on the moon. But as such, you have a very sort of slow rate of change. Occasionally, an asteroid will hit the moon. There's going to be like a low level cycling of things. You guarantee that, if you throw a shoe on the moon's surface, it's probably still going to be there, in 10,000, 20,000 years. Whereas you put a shoe in your average forest, it's gone like within 10,000 years. Life is just going to have its way with it. So the appearance of life has shifted gears, and the appearance of mind has shifted gears again on the space-time of change. So it won't be the same clock. You can't use the same clock to look at processes of non-life versus life versus thinking human expression. There'd be different magnitudes of change.
Yeah, things are going at a very fast pace as we speak, as far as evolution goes.
Yeah,
like of the mind and the information age, that's accelerating like crazy.
Yeah.
In some ways yes, in some ways no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that I'm reading section 4 while listening to guys. I'm sure that all of you will be quite excited by section 4 because Vernadsky is giving his answer, and that's a quite complex answer, to use the word complex.
All right, let's go for it. Let's finish number 2 and then let's make our way to number 4.
Did we leave off at life constitutes?
We left off at moreover.
Moreover, in the course of centuries, the forms of energy connected to life, the solar radiation, and probably the atomic energy of radioactive matter are not modified overall in terms of their amount. We do not register in all these phenomena anything but oscillations, sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another, around a mean magnitude which appears to us as constant. Does someone else want to read?
Declan, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I can do it. All right, so number 3. The immutability which characterizes all cosmic processes in the course of geological time offers a striking contrast to the profound modifications undergone at the same time by the living forms studied in biology. In particular, it is absolutely certain that all the characteristics of species established by geochemical phenomena are, again and again, radically modified throughout the geological epochs. Many a time have numerous animal and vegetable species disappeared, and new species were formed with a different weight, a different chemical composition, and another geochemical energy than those which preceded them. We cannot doubt that the chemical composition of bodies, which are morphologically diverse, is not altogether different. The extinct species necessarily correspond to other forms of homogeneous living matter, which have now gone extinct. Their numerical constants were different. If, nevertheless, the general action of life remains identically the same in its details as compared, for example, with the phenomena of erosion, this indicates the possibility of the formation of new groupings of the chemical elements, but not radical modifications of their composition and their quantity. These new groupings do not affect the constancy and immutability of geological processes. It is a new fact of enormous importance for science, and we are beholden to its introduction into the domain of biology, to the geochemical study of life. Whereas morphological, geometrical aspects of life taken in its entirety undergoes great changes and continually manifests itself by the great evolution of living forms since the Archaeozoic era, the numerical, quantitative formula of life, always taken in its entirety, remains immutable in its essential proportions, and it seems well to be the case in its essential functions. It is true that the attentive study of the phenomena of evolution, in the case of biology, reveal the extreme irregularity of its progress. It cannot be a question of constant change of all species, of a constant change of all species, of all forms of life. On the contrary, certain species remain immutable for hundreds of millions of years, as, for example, the species of Radiolaria from the Precambrian epoch, which are impossible to distinguish from those of today. The same also goes for the species of the Lingula, which, since the Cambrian until our days, have not undergone a single change. They have stayed the same during the course of hundreds of millions of years across innumerable generations which succeeded. We can cite a general number of analogous examples for periods which may not be as long, during which, if there were changes, they were, in any case, of little consideration. We can also, consequently, observe and study in living forms, not their variability, but their extraordinary stability. It could even be that this stability of forms of species over the course of millions of years, millions of generations, is the most characteristic trait of living forms and merits the most profound attention of the biologist. These purely biological phenomena are probably the manifestation of immutability of life, of the immutability of life, considered in its essence in the course of all geological history. Immutability, which, in another form, is revealed through its role in the mechanism of the biosphere. This stability of species would merit, it seems, to draw more attention from the biologist than is currently the case. The thought of the contemporary biologist orients itself in another direction. The evolution of forms in the course of geological time seems to be the most essential trait of the history of life. It embraces, for us, all living nature. This phenomenon was noted empirically and in an absolutely rigorous way 100 years ago by G. Cuvier, a naturalist of great profundity and precision, who demonstrated the existence of another universe, which we have ignored, of an earlier geological epoch. Does somebody want to read the footnote?
Juan, you want to go for that?
Yeah, sure. This likely refers to Cuvier's theories on catastrophisms. Here we quote his 1796 paper on living and fossil elephants. All of these facts, consistent among themselves, are not opposed by any report, seem to me to prove the existence of a world previous to ours, destroyed by some kind of catastrophe.
There you go. That touches on our previous conversation.
This consideration served as a provocation during the lives of A. Wallace and C. Darwin, and later provoked a radical change in the entire conception of the scientific universe of the naturalist. The evolution of species occupies a central place in this conception, but draws attention to it to the point of forgetting about other biological phenomena, which are just as important, if not more. The notion of evolution of species occupies a certain space in scientific thought, such that the new phenomenon, such as a new phenomenon or a new explanation in the domain of biology must, to be admitted, relate itself to this in a more or less explicit way. It is important to shed light on the manifestations of this evolution in biogeochemical processes, because the latest developments in geochemical studies are now stopped short for lack of facts, which only the biologists can supply. The biogeochemical phenomena have to enter into the sphere of the biologists. But in addition, the research of the relationship, which certainly exists between the evolution of species and biogeochemical phenomena, is, on its own, of great interest. This relationship between the evolution of species and the mechanism of the biosphere, and with the progress of the living processes, is not in doubt. The fact that the essential number which characterize these processes are properties of species which modify themselves in the course of evolution would suffice to prove it, and it is precisely the study of this relationship which will permit us to determine those relationships which exist between the immutability of the laws of life, considered in their entirety in geochemistry, and its evolution, always considered in its entirety in biology. It is one of most important scientific problems of our time.
I know this is the big number 4 you wanted to get at, but I think it would be worth maybe taking a moment here. Do people have an idea of the emphasis, or do people think that it's contradictory? I know the first time I read this, I thought at first he was being contradictory by talking about the immutability of life in some way within a geochemical process, you know, on a long scale, and then talking about the importance of the evolution and mutability of life in just the next paragraph. Do people find that contradictory at all, or do you get how he's got these two thoughts going at the same time?
Can you explain what's mutability and immutability?
Immutability, change and no change.
Right,
So
okay.
how you have some phenomenon of incredible stability. Do people have an example that they could think of like something he might be thinking about when he described the incredible stability of certain living processes in time, as opposed to the instability, the change of life in other ways?
Well, you see, like, it seems like elephants and manatees and stuff like that have kind of been, they have quite similar fossil records over time, I believe. And well, other like we've talked about, like horses and domesticated animals have radically changed over the course of history.
That's a good point. I mean, you still have some things like woolly mammoths that we don't see anymore as an ancestor to the elephant.
That's true.
But yeah, I see where you're getting at. Any other examples of the immutability of life, or examples of that might exist over really long periods of time that we don't see a change?
Are you talking about like a process or photosynthesis?
Yeah, that was the first one that hit me in the head. Yeah, of chlorophyll. Yeah, that has been constant, even though the expressions of chlorophyll, like the different species that have chlorophyll, are very different over time. The molecule itself that does the work of chlorophyll, the photosynthesis, that's a constant. Yeah, that's one of those constants.
And then mitochondria would be the other one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's go back to the essential, the replication of the DNA.
Go on. Oh
Wow,
yeah, you're
that-
saying like just the act of replace. Yeah, the act of doing that.
Well, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, simply as one of the small paragraphs of his text, the stability of species. Okay.
Yeah.
That elephants will always produce other elephants, and crocodiles will always produce other crocodiles. But it goes back once again to the DNA stuff.
As well. Yeah.
Hmm.
Also, DNA as a transmitter of light, as a that it both expresses, it absorbs and expresses light as well.
I wanted to say something not entirely off topic, but on crocodiles and DNA. Have people seen house cats' reactions to crocodiles?
In Florida.
They
Yeah.
they imagine themselves to be the predators of crocodiles, and apparently, like, there are large cats still that hunt at least alligators. I don't know if it's crocodiles, but house cats still have this memory, and they will. And the crocodiles and alligators are actually afraid of them. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, there's tons of videos like that on YouTube where people are camping, and yeah, you just see they bring their cats with them to like the Florida Everglades and stuff. And these cats just have no fear, and they know that somewhere deep down they can destroy alligators, and the alligators know deep down that they should be afraid, and they are, and it's the strangest thing to watch. Yeah, have Darwin explain that one away.
Well, okay. The conclusion of the lessons: keep your 2 cats.
Yeah, exactly. We might get overrun by alligators. We need protectors.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
So
this idea of an egregore, or I'm sorry, did somebody want to talk first?
no, I was just gonna go on.
Oh, well, fear, like that's a concept, or is that something from the noosphere? Or fear in a human being, and I'm thinking about like how it becomes a thing, like a mass formation kind of thing.
Great question.
And is that immutable?
It might participate in something immutable. I was thinking about an example of like we know that all living matter produces light. Every time there's a cell mitosis, there's the generation of light as a very low intensity light. They only started picking this up, a few decades ago. Now Vernadsky and his students, like Gurvich, who was a direct student of Vernadsky, would be very careful to distinguish the light produced within living organisms as not necessarily the same quality of light as we see coming out of, let's say, a fire that we light. Even though there's a lot of similarities, they wouldn't jump the gun. Just like we found recently that the water in living organisms is not the same as the water that comes out of our tap, right? There's stuff like the 4th phase of water that's more recently discovered. So I think that when you're dealing with fear, obviously it would be silly to say my cat is never afraid, or other organisms an ant is not afraid when, it's a little kid is burning it with a magnifying glass. That there's probably a quality of fear coming out of these organisms. But to jump the gun the way some, social engineers and materialists do by saying all fear is created equal, it's the same thing as what we feel as humans. It would be a presumptuous thing to do. There's probably something very different going on with the quality of fear expressed by humans, and also what's the type of fear, right? There's legitimate fears, there's irrational fears, there's all sorts of. It's more complex with humans, I think.
Also, there's the concept of like bravery, and so bravery is overcoming your fears. And so can an animal overcome its fears? Well, we can't.
Probably not in the same way. I mean, a bird has to overcome its fears when it's going to learn to fly, right? At a certain point, its mom is going to boost it off the branch. But will it be able to overcome its fears in the same way that humans overcome our fears? We probably have things, a wider spectrum, a more rich spectrum to make that leap than we find in animals.
Or even like the concept of like self-sacrifice or doing something you cannot do, and attempting to do that is more of a human characteristic.
Although we find animals like moms of almost any especially mammal species will tend to sacrifice themselves in a fight if their kids are threatened, right?
That's true.
Or to make it even more complicated for you, Declan, animal species like lions will adopt deers that they were going to hunt. Let's say they killed the mom. There's cases where a lion has adopted another species of baby because its maternal instincts kicked in. And
no, it was a male.
Oh, it was a male lion. Okay, it's maternal instincts.
It was a young male lion that was hunting the deer, but it was like a baby deer, and then it decided to actually protect it, but it couldn't take care of it. And there's like another example of a jaguar with a baby monkey. It killed the mother, and then there was a baby with the mother, and it was actually it killed the mother and it ate the mother, and then it tried to take care of the baby, but it didn't know how. And the baby died. So there's strange examples.
Anti-Darwinian modes of behavior, being expressed in the higher life. And then the question is, well, why don't we see that in like reptilian animals, where we or like spiders and bugs and stuff, where they don't have those same access to the same spectrum of emotions. They sort of lay their eggs and move on. Or they, the babies eat the mom and move on, right? Or the mom eats the babies, as just part of the mechanism. No, not the last one. That one I don't think happens very much. But anyway, that would not work very well for the.
Yeah, it seems like lots of species cross different thresholds and of just characteristics of life.
Yeah, but then the question I would say for the humans, not to try to get across the idea that we're all the same, because the question then is, well, could another species create sacrifices for itself or even risk its own life for an idea, right? Or generations in the future that don't exist yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
It probably won't do that, or in honor of generations before it existed that sacrificed, to make a better lion kingdom, that it's going to like live more nobly for the Disney says yes, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
But for that, the lion needs to create lionine cultures.
Lionine cultures? Okay.
Yes. Well, cultures of the lion. Okay, because what is the difference between us and the animals? Because we have cultures, we have history, so that we can project into the future. And it's also a key point. Okay, it's a biogeochemical cultural organization. To a certain extent, the biogeochemical structures giving life, and that life is organized enough to create cultures, and those cultures will create ideals. And those ideals participate to the new sphere. And going back, according to the traditional answer, I'm not saying that the traditional answer is the answer, but according to the traditional answer, creating the new sphere, allowing us to go back to the primary spark of life, consciousness.
To reflect on it, at least.
Pardon me?
To reflect on it, at least.
Absolutely.
And if you check through a lot of the mythologies of almost all ancient civilizations and cultures, you'll probably find a story there of a crocodile that ate a baby and the baby transformed.
Yeah.
There'll be connections into the past, references from the past, if you like, that can assist in a projection into the future as well.
Yeah. So when the dolphins start making their own mythologies, then we have competition.
I can think of a good example here, which ties into some of the things that were spoken about earlier, and catastrophism, if you like, under that general heading. When Graham Hancock wrote his first book, something of the gods. I can't think of the first title. Anyway, it was a worldwide bestseller. And to fit his story, to give a credible hypothesis as to where the famed Atlantis might still be, he postulated that there was at least a chance that it was under tons of ice under Antarctica. If ever it was a continent underwater, then that one fit. But then a decade or more later, when he came out with the second book, Magicians of the Gods, there had been all of this new research onto an asteroid strike that was a dead straight fit for relatively recent archaeological evidence to do with a place called Göbekli Tepe, which took, excavations back to 12,000 BC and even earlier. And this was an archaeological site that was both created, that reflected all sorts of astrophysical projections, etc., animal drawings on the sides, etc., which matched up with cultures from the other side of the world in some cases, and then was deliberately covered up. And the timing of that happens to match with elements of this asteroid strike that was purportedly in North America and caused the massive flood that is written about in every mythology that follows on from there as well. So another intriguing one that shows you how quickly something can change.
Lots of lines of interesting discoveries and vistas that are being kept withheld from us. That's for sure. So yeah, let's. I think we can finish one last section. This is the one that Quan said was really juicy. I'm really curious to see number 4, and then I think that'll be a good ending point for tonight's reading before we kick back in for next week. Declan, you want to go for number 4?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
All right, number 4. We can take on this problem starting from the study of the biogenic migration of chemical elements of the biosphere, characterized by the regularity of forms which it takes. We will call the migration of chemical elements all displacement of chemical elements, whatever may be the cause. The migration in the biosphere can be determined by chemical processes. For example, at the time of volcanic eruptions, it occurs by the movement of liquid, solid, and gaseous masses. In the case of evaporations and of the formation of deposits, it is present in the movement of rivers, marine currents, winds, sediment transport, and displacements of the Earth's crust. The biogenic migration provoked by the intervention of life, thought of in its entirety, counts among the most grandiose and also typical processes of the biosphere and constitutes the essential trait of its mechanism. Innumerable quantities of atoms are submitted to the action of this uninterrupted biogenic migration. It is not useful to insist here on the effect produced in the biosphere by a biogenic migration at a given scale. We have treated this question more than once. It is important, nevertheless, to point out several essential traits of the biogenic migration, because it is indispensable to know them to understand what follows. In the first place, there exist several absolutely diverse forms of biogenic migration. On the one hand, the biogenic migration is linked to the most intimate way, and genetically to the matter of the living organism, to its existence. Cuvier gave a correct and precise definition of the living organism during its life as an incessant current, a whirlpool of atoms which come from the exterior and return there. The organism lives as long as the current of atoms subsists. The current encompasses all of the material of the organism. Each organism on its own, or all organisms taken together, continually creates, by respiration, nutrition, internal metabolism, or reproduction, a biogenic current of atoms, which constructs and maintains living matter. In sum, it is the essential form and principle of the biogenic migration, of which the numerical importance is determined by the mass of living matter existing in a given moment on our planet. But this is not yet the entire biogenic migration. Evidently, the effect of the entire biogenic migration does not depend directly on the mass of living matter. It does not depend any less on the quantity of atoms that on the intensity of their movements in intimate relation with life. The biogenic migration will be all the more intense as the atoms circulate more quickly. This migration can be very diverse, even while the quantity of atoms encompassed by life is identical. That is the second form of biogenic migration in relation to the intensity of the biogenic current of atoms. There exists still a third. This third form begins to take on in our epoch and the psychotic epoch, an extraordinary psychozoic, okay, epoch,
yeah.
An extraordinary importance in the history of our planet.
Now we're getting into the domain of human thought.
It is the migration of atoms, also sustained by organisms, but which is not genetically or immediately related to the penetration or to the passage of atoms through their body. This migration is provoked by technological activity. It is, for example, determined by the work of burrowing animals, of which we notice traces since the most ancient geological epochs, by the consequences of the social life of building animals, termites, ants, and beavers. But this form of biogenic migration of chemical elements has taken on an extraordinary development since the appearance of civilized humanity, since tens of thousands of years ago. Entirely new substances have been created in this way, as for example, metals in a free state. The face of the earth transforms itself, and the virgin nature disappears. This migration does not seem to be related directly to the mass of living matter. It is conditioned in its essential traits by the working of the thought of the conscious organism. It is necessary, finally, probably in the fourth place, to also add the changes in the distribution of atoms provoked by the appearance in the biosphere of new compounds of organic origin. It is probably, as for its effects, the most powerful form of biogenic migration. It cannot yet be numerically evaluated, and I will not concern myself with it today. This is the case, for example, of the migration which determines the release of free oxygen by chlorophyllc organisms, or that caused the transformation of chemical compounds, unknown of until now in the biosphere, and for those transformations created by the genius of man. It is true that this type of chemical migration cannot always be easily distinguished from the first two. For example, a powerful chemical migration provoked by the destruction of bodies of dead organisms is intimately linked to the processes of putrefaction and fermentation, sustained by the existence of special organisms. But the biogeochemical processes do not explain this entirely.
So how many different types of biogenic migration of atoms did he enumerate in the course of this? It was 4, right, in total?
Yeah, and he said the fourth one he was like not going to address at all.
Yeah, it's a whole can of worms that I don't think I'm being, that's not a pun, no, that he's opening up there. but again, this change, no change technique, it's really fruitful, right? To always have in the mind when you're looking at a process you don't understand, in what way does it change? In what way does it not change? And then having that as your constant guide. This is what Plato did all the time in his dialogues. And pretty much every great scientist is you'll find when you read their writings, they're always using that same technique of looking for what is constant as they guide themselves into the unknown before they make their discovery, and then what is changing. All right. This also very much reminded me, I think what I'd like to do before we read Henry C. Carey is read Abraham Lincoln's speech on discoveries and inventions, where he goes through his appreciation of technology, of beavers and of bees that exist in nature without human thought, and how these things make technology, and they're sort of industrious, but the quality of organization of the dams of the beaver are no different today than they were 5,000 years ago. Whereas human beings, the dams that we make are qualitatively different based on certain things we do that the beavers don't have access to, even though they didn't have to learn, they didn't have to go to school to make their dams, right? It's an interesting speech. And I think that's what are we looking at here? This is a picture of
Burrowing.
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 Is it like an ant? No,
I think it's just like, that's like a tunnel system. So it's like a fossil of a tunnel system, or not a fossil, but anyway, it's a piece that they took out.
Interesting.
Have you ever seen those pictures of where they like dig up like an underground subterranean ant thing?
Yeah,
and it's just complex. This whole, all those networks is amazing.
Yeah.
See.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the fascinating thing about when you look at life as a system, there's these interesting interconnectedness to everything, right? That you can't look at any particular species without thinking about, well, what is its function within a broader system? And in the Darwinian approach, there's a tendency to really overemphasize the individual species as in combat with other species for a fight for life, right? And you start getting the sense that, well, or you're not able to explain how you have these phenomenon like where there's this particular wasp that evolved with a certain species of ant, and this wasp releases a pheromone such that the ants perceive the egg of the wasp as one of their own ant eggs, and will then take care of the wasp egg like it's one of their own because of this pheromone. And at a certain point, when the wasp does hatch, it eats all of the other baby ant eggs that it's hanging out with, right? And just flies off and does its own thing. I'm not sure what the ants get out of this deal.
Yeah,
probably have something.
There's an example of a fungus also doing that with ants, where they farm it for some reason, and then it can the spores can lodge in an ant's brain. This is what I was taught in university. I didn't ever verify it, but like that it can actually get the ant to go to one of the higher points in the forest, and then it like sprouts out of the ant's body to disperse its spores in like the most effective, efficient way. And it's like, what the hell? How did it make the ant do that?
Well, it's kind of horrifying. Again, I'd like to think that there's some symbiotic give and take in that process, but there's definitely, it's difficult to explain how such a mechanism of relationships would occur from a simple Darwinian standpoint of random mutations. Just like, first you tried, to be like perfume, and that pheromone didn't work for the spore, and then you tried something else, and then all of a sudden you got the right chemical molecular mixture, and that's what the ants resonated to, and they're no, there's definitely something more that deals with purpose, form, function, and design that's being ignored. That's very important.
Or even our bodies, like we rely on so many organisms for our bodies to function.
Yeah, we're mostly made of other organisms in terms of the bacteria and other things that are making up our insides. It's wild. Yeah, it's a little universe.
Really, even see like back to your point about, is there a purpose for things? You look at how, have you seen like the documentaries about how they took the wolves out of Yosemite and then how they brought them back in and how it changed the course of the rivers because they kept down the deer population that was feeding, and when the deer would feed, it would corrupt the banks, the river banks, and they would fall in. And so when the wolves came, they kept down the deer populations, and so then the banks stabilized again.
Huh. Interesting. That's a great Vernadskian example of the biogeochemical system, right? It's that the life is not just affecting life; it's affecting the entire geology of the whole system. So that's interesting. Yeah, I like this idea of the whirlpool idea too, of Cuvier's concept of life, living organisms, not really as objects in space the way the naive senses would perceive, but rather as a whirlpool, constantly bringing in material, transforming it inside, and then expelling it, through respiration, nutrition, metabolism, and reproduction. Like these mechanisms allow for this constant flux. But to think of everything like a whirlpool, it's an interesting thought experiment, right?
Is the whirlpool like the organisms with the highest metabolism? Is it like it more at the center of it? And then the things with the lower metabolism are like further away, and that's how it's being cycled through?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Yeah, like organisms that have a low metabolic power, you could conceptualize as very like a wide, slow, a not very dense whirlpool, whereas metabolisms like higher mammalian life that has a high matter energy conversion when they eat food that becomes energy to do work, right? Like a mammal, it's like 15% of the food is converted into energy, whereas like your average lizard, your average reptile, it's something like 2%. It's not as much at all that's turned into energy, which is also why the lizard doesn't have as much sovereignty of motion. Like it doesn't have an internal heating or body regulator. So when it's cold, the reptile can't move very much. Whereas with the mammal, it can regulate much more effectively and go into colder domains, not necessarily shut down right away, the way a snake would or something, So yeah, you could say that would be like a more condensed form of whirlpool. In the LaRouche terminology, the flux density would be higher, right, of one than another.
How would you compare that to like like an example, like in a living organism?
Give me an example.
Well, he was asking you for an example.
Oh, you'd like just any old random example?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Well, I guess when you think about your average like mouse eating food, versus a gecko eating food, the food intake is going to be like once the food is in the body, the molecules, the atoms that make up whatever food you're feeding the gecko or the mouse will then go through some processes inside the body. In the case of the mouse, which does a lot more motion, right? The metabolic activity, it has to eat more food, first of all, in terms of quantity, than the gecko. The gecko doesn't move around as much, it doesn't need as much metabolic power, and so it doesn't.
So there's more material, there's moving through the mouse.
Oh yeah, by far. Yeah, and the mouse thus has a higher heart rate, more blood flux, more oxygen intake and expulsion, more poop, right? That'll, I guess, over geological time, having a mouse population will have certain geological effects, maybe in terms of where, maybe where they poop, where they die, where their bones fall, how that incorporates into the geology of an environment. You might find certain things over long spans of time accumulating in the forms of, like mineral deposits, which we wouldn't find, let's say, on a low life area like the moon, where there's no deposits of anything. Everything is diffused.
Wait, so you're saying that poop has a poetic function?
Maybe a creative function.
Don't tell me you're thinking
Dave
of
is inspired of a new
on this.
Dave's next poem. We know the
Hope is
theme will be.
poetic. That's a good line. I'm taking it.
But yeah, I would think that the gecko, well, I think I know that
Well,
geckos.
that's also used, by the way, for seed transferal too, right?
Oh yeah, right.
And when you had like migratory animals as well, and they're spreading seeds, they're spreading whatever, they're eating, so that these things can then, have their effects in other regions.
Right. Yeah, totally. That's yeah, I forgot about that. So you wouldn't, yeah. And in that sense, you could see a human economy, like what would be a difference between a medieval economy versus, let's say, an 18th century economy versus a 21st century economy, would also, you'd have metabolism expressing itself a little bit differently that you'd be looking for in terms of the efficiency of burning fire using different forms of fuel that give us a greater power of sustaining the species as a whole, right? You couldn't take medieval technology, medieval forms of burning fuel or burning wood to sustain life and life's activity and just impose it onto 20th century society or 21st century. It wouldn't work. We'd create all sorts of constraints, just like you couldn't give a gecko diet and expect it to be a mouse for very long. it would seize up, its body would shut down. Which is what, again, the Green New Deal, if you want to get a sense of like what's the scientific rationale why the Green New Deal is anti-human or anti-scientific, it's because it's basically trying to tell humanity to go back to a previous state of evolutionary metabolism that we just, if you chose to do it, you'd be going against the force of nature. You'd be shutting down your potential in all sorts of ways and not being able to, you wouldn't be able to support very many people anymore.
There goes the civet industry in Asia.
Sorry,
there goes the civet cat industry in Bali, Indonesia.
They had industry in Bali, Indonesia?
Civet cats, they're the one they pass coffee beans through.
Oh, yeah, right. That sell for a lot of money, right?
An exquisite cup of coffee that sells at an exponentially large price, etc., etc., etc.
Part of me is curious to try that out someday.
20th century development, 19th century development.
Okay. Was that Warren?
Matt, on that energy question, we've our media in Australia is currently pushing this idea of shaming businesses who are currently using too much energy because we've got a gas and electricity crisis. They've warned us that we all need to cut back, but now there's a shaming going on where businesses leaving the lights on. And this is a little bit like, it's familiar to the COVID crisis where they shamed us.
Yeah.
But this will move on to energy as we know, and the sustainable development goals. That will be the
shutting down all the neon advertising.
What's that?
Shutting down advertising. Shutting down all the neon advertising.
That would certainly shut down the shame and fear.
That would help. That would help. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah. No, it's exactly that. That gets to Jolie's. Did I get it right, Jolie? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, your point on the question of fear and necessary versus unnecessary fear, and how the oligarchy creates unnecessary fears. There's things that you should be afraid of, and things that we have no reason to be afraid of. And what we're being fed right now are complete unnecessary fears about keeping your lights on or flushing the toilet. Which is somehow causing water to disappear from the earth. It's like, what? Versus, the fear of, well, maybe shutting down food production is going to cause a lot of death. Maybe we should be afraid of the consequence of that and stop doing it. That would be a correct form of fear that could result in correct action. That would be useful. Rick says, I'm guessing, Rick, your mic's not working. Parasitism, I can't pronounce that. Parasitism makes sense in an evolutionary sense, as it doesn't actually kill the host, because the host as an individual is simply one of a larger self-perpetuating colony. Exactly. The Great Reset is an attempt to take us back to feudalism. Modern society requires high density energy sources. Amen to that. Yes.
Another thing, going back to what we're comparing, like a gecko and a mouse, even look at like herbivores versus carnivores, and how a herbivore, like a cow, is always grazing, and while a carnivore is out moving, is a lot more mobile. And because it's looking for food, it has a different food source. And it's kind of interesting to look at like how the humans are not always eating. And so that's kind of like an argument against the vegan diet, is that you need to be grazing the entire time to actually get enough energy.
There's this gecko that I have a greenhouse in the backyard, and there's this gecko that is the cutest little thing. And it, I could swear, you know, I don't know, I'm anthropomorphizing this whole thing, but this gecko it's very complicated in its reaction to me, and it's quite interesting. It comes out from where it's hiding and gets right in front of me and runs like it creates this drama every time. And I don't understand it. It's like it could just stay hiding, but it loves, this is what I think. I mean, it seems like, anyway, it loves the drama, the interaction, and then it disappears. It's odd. So, I mean, you know, it makes me question whether geckos are actually, you know, more complicated than we might think.
I think that they might be a little bit more complicated than I'm maybe giving them credit. Like we've seen, you know, cases where there's iguanas that are kept as pets, which the bigger iguanas especially will respond sometimes to like having a relationship with a human and having their name called, and they'll come.
Right.
Little iguanas don't seem to do that. There doesn't seem to be examples of that. I don't know why. Maybe physiologically, I have no idea. But there does seem to be something that is being touched upon that is more regularized in the higher mammalian life. You know, the warm-blooded creatures, you see these playful characteristics more widely, but you still seem to see that as little slivers of it being pressed upon in the lizard life too.
You see it in fish too.
Oh yeah, you see it in fish. Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, fish will play with humans.
Fish also like to play.
And I wonder about the light frequencies that wherever how we're traveling in the universe, and the light frequencies that are coming in, and whether we're, you know, whether things are morphing, you know, tangibly, where animals are gaining a kind of an extra consciousness.
Well, I think that they're striving. I think that all life is striving towards, you know, a purpose that we're all in, like, because we're all designed, I think, towards a certain direction. But as you were talking about the different time frames, they're on a different time frame than we are. So the challenges that we're going to be confronted with, the Noosphere and where we need to go in the next phase, because obviously we're hitting a point right now where we have to become more mature as a species if we're going to continue to exist with each other, because the whole idea of war, just war in as a topic, but economy as well, it's getting to a point where we can't continue. Like if you read some of the stories that have happened in ancient times of just like the day-to-day life and how people interacted, we're really not that different in terms of our personalities, the kinds of prejudices or biases that we so easily get into. And we're at a point where we really have to figure out a way, not for necessarily everyone to just become like all of a sudden, you know, a sage or a wise person, but we do have to figure out a way to have a leadership that cultivates a certain environment where, you know, that the next level for wisdom needs to be reached. And I think that animals are striving towards, you know, something higher as well. And I think that that's why animals too gravitate around us. Like we have cats, one of our cats is not very social. And I believe she's also not as smart as our other cat, but he always has to be around us. And it's like, also, remember when you're a kid, you don't necessarily understand what the adults are saying, but you need
My job is to make college easier because students. Oh, sorry.
What is that about?
That was the little ambient noise around Warren. It's okay.
Oh, and then he left.
So Warfield is his personality is different.
Yeah, like he likes to be around. He likes to be around people.
Marty's got to go. Marty, I'm going to read your contributions after you go. They're very good thoughts you just threw out there. Can't hear you at all. Marty. Okay. See you, man. All right. Yeah, go on, Cynthia. I'm sorry.
I pretty much, I think, made my point.
Well, I do think of in respect to the animal thing, I've thought about this, and I feel like I've heard Kwan talk about, when he talks about awareness, or when we talk about consciousness, right? Like I don't want to think about it quantitatively, or I do, but I know that's not right. But it's like they have a certain level of awareness about themselves and the world. And human beings have like a different kind of consciousness. Like they're conscious, right? Life is conscious, but it's limited in how it's able to express it within those forms. And human beings have a different kind of consciousness, but it's not like it's completely different, right? It's more. Okay, it sounds a lot better in my head. I'm not saying.
No, I hear exactly what you're saying, Dave.
I sound like a hippie right now, but that's not.
No, but I would add too.
Life itself is conscious, but not in the same way as humans are. Sorry, yeah, I don't want to.
Well, I think it's on the same path though, right? It's not like it's one compartment. It's like one thing, and this is another thing. I think it's all along, the same trajectory, and we ourselves have to challenge ourselves to a higher consciousness as well. So even though we're at a certain state, and not everybody is at the same, by the way, we can challenge ourselves to be much of a much higher consciousness than we are. Or I think also, like, sometimes you hear the stories like St. Patrick going into the Irish with the Irish barbarians and how they used to communicate, and the way that it's described, at least in that really good book. What's it called, Matt? How the Irish Saved Civilization. I forget the name of the author, but he was describing that they thought more in terms of images and symbols, and it wasn't language, right? Like we think very much more around language nowadays. And so he had to figure out how to communicate ideas to them when they had been very much used to imagery kind of thought. I'm not explaining that fully because I myself don't have a fully detailed idea of how the Irish were thinking at this stage, but I think that we have so much further to go. This isn't like where we're at in our consciousness. I mean, unless we have to get better, or else nothing can stay static, right? If we want to, I think, be able to live and continue advancements of sorts, which are going to have consequences, we are going to have to also, I think, transform.
Well, we have to grow up.
We can always improve.
Yeah. No, don't be, guys. This is totally true. Dave.
Sorry, we're free loving Summer of Love.
It's because like the vocabulary, I don't have the vocabulary, so it might sound stupid.
No. I mean, look, I think that the idea of the self-perfectibility idea that the founding fathers of the United States had is the concept that we're made in the image of a creative God, and that as such, the governance that we give ourselves has to be of a self-perfecting character as well. Which is why there's the idea of, in order to form a more perfect union, it is philosophically such a rich idea. It's that they understood that you're never going to have a finished product that will just have the finalized perfect laws. Otherwise, they just would have said a perfect union. They said a more perfect union, implying that it could always be made better, and you have to have the seeds of renewal embedded within the society's, soul. So that's your identity. It has to be constant renewal, constant renaissance, and going back and rediscovering what made you good. And you can't get stale. If you get stale for too many generations, you lose the living force, right? And things have you need a miracle almost. You need a Socrates, you need a Christ, you need a St. Augustine or St. Patrick to go in and
Which is possible.
Which is possible. Yeah, I mean, a rational miracle here, right? But you definitely need something to shake society out of its stupor at that type of point.
Which is culture, what you're bringing up.
It's culture, yeah, and that's the thing. Like the culture of animals is there's a limited culture. It's there. They have elephants have like elephant graveyard areas, where they just go and die. They don't necessarily keep records of their family trees and all, but they've got a certain set of relations and behavior that's particular to elephants that you won't find in wolves. And elephants will seek satisfaction. They'll always seek to try to be as elephant-like as they can, right? They'll eat elephant food. They want to find an elephant mate. What's sexy for the tiger won't be sexy for the elephant. And so they're always seeking satisfaction. And so you have this impulse, this yearning in the individual, but also probably within the deeper species character too. Like you were saying, Cynthia, I think there's a deeper yearning for, on some level to improve.
That's why animals like us too. I mean, we can have a good relationship with pretty much any animal, and there's something that they see that they gravitate towards.
Yeah, exactly. And the oligarchs, they tend to want to define us as being just another form of animal that should rightfully, like their dogs, constantly just behave well according to rewards and punishment. Mm-hmm. And we don't do that, and it kind of gets them a little bit enraged because there's something else that they're choosing to ignore about the creatures, the humans, that they want to serve them, or at least be obedient to them, which we will never do, because that's just not how we're made. Right? We're just we seek satisfaction both for the physical aspect of ourselves, but also for the soul. Right? We want satisfaction of wisdom. We hunger for the higher things, mm-hmm. and not just for the physical things. Which
that comes back to Declan's question on self-sacrifice. The quality of self-sacrifice is very different with mm-hmm. humans.
Yeah, that's what makes us happy, is things that would physically sometimes make us uncomfortable are actually things that are part of what feeds the soul.
I just have a second stab at what I tried to say before.
Yeah, do it. Sure.
So working backwards this time, we start with absolute consciousness. All there is absolute consciousness. Then you have, let's say, the human mind, right, which has a relative consciousness. You have animals. And we could say even abiotic life, right? It's not conscious. It doesn't have any self-directed will of any sort or agency, but it has order, right? Like molecules and different atoms behave in a certain way. They still follow a certain structure and order. I don't think that we can say that isn't an expression of a kind of consciousness, in the sense that there's an ordering and it's following like light, right? Light, Leibniz talks about the least time principle. Light will always take the path that of the least time. Mm-hmm. And that freaked a lot of scientists out, because mm-hmm. they're like, you're suggesting that there's a teleological principle to inanimate matter. And he was basically saying, that, but not in the sense that we think about it in just like, I'm conscious and I'm existential Sartre staring at a tree, but and feel like throwing up, but just that there's a principle of order and directionality, and it's expressed at different levels. But to say that it's not, maybe it's 0.000000001% consciousness, but even the atoms have an ordering, even light takes a direction at every point, every time. So there's an intelligence.
Or would you say it's a yearning? Would it be the same, a yearning versus a consciousness? Because I don't think it's really consciousness, but I think that you're right in what you're saying, that everything that has the life principle has a yearning for a specific direction. But I don't know, like consciousness for me means more than what a molecule could do.
But it still has to know what to do.
Well, it has to obey the laws of nature.
But how do you know to do
and
that?
it's happy, to do it in the sense of, not like a feeling emotion, but it's a yearning, everything that is created. But the life principle will have the yearning towards, the potential that it can partake in with the life principle. And so, yeah, everything is tuned to the same harmonic process.
And, could, Cynthia, that be also defined like in terms of like relationship, a yearning for relationship with other elements of the world that we live in? And I was just thinking about, flux density as a spiral motion that defines different organisms. Say, I'm going back to the rocks now because I really like rocks, and I really think that they, and now I will out myself. They communicate. I mean, there's just no doubt about it to me. So, does that make me crazy? Light particles coming in. You guys are really intelligent. It's obvious that beyond the discipline, you have an openness that something is feeding into you in order to spark more than just book knowledge. Is it light? What is it? It's like it's some sort of a divinity or something, and so that, to me, that it's just self-evident. But why we have to dance around these things, maybe it's not self-evident, and maybe I'm making all these assumptions that everybody else sees the same thing that I do. But I don't think it's like being a hippie necessarily to or whatever, we laugh, but I think we've canceled out the notion of the mystery, the connection, the relationship connection that, we're in concert with, all that holds, rather than gravity. It seems like there's some sort of a relationship that holds us onto this earth,
Can I say something on that point?
Yeah.
When you read the work of Johannes Kepler, who did some incredible things like 400 and so years ago, he zeroed in on his laws of planetary motion by looking at not just the platonic solids, which also animates the growth of crystals, right? We know that there's definite organization of how the atoms within crystal structures form based on their outward macro expression, right? That says something about the internal geometry. But he was looking at both the micro formation he was looking at crystals, and he was looking at the motions of the planets around a sun. And he was looking at the 5 solids with an emphasis on the pentagon and the dodecahedron as the most important, because that's the one that is constructed with the golden section, right? So you have to figure out the golden section, which Plato was working on in order to produce the pentagon, in order to put 12 of them together and get your dodecahedron. And he was looking at his first hypothesis was nesting the solids in an organized way to get certain proportions using certain what's called duals, right? That the pentagon and the icosahedron are duals of each other. Because when you connect all the center points of the pentagon, connect them together, you get an icosahedron, and vice versa. And the same thing for the octahedron and the cube. When you connect the center points of the faces of the triangles on the octahedron together, you get a cube, and vice versa. When you connect the center points of the squares on the cube together, you get an octahedron. And the tetrahedron is its own dual. So he found a rational ordering of them together that produced certain proportions. And it wasn't a coincidence, he thought, that the golden section, which occurs both in the dodecahedron as well as in the icosahedron, even though the icosahedron has triangles, you'll find inside of it there are two pentagons. That the golden section, which is characteristic of life, that's what Da Vinci was working on, right? You won't tend to find it very obviously in crystal formations. You'll tend to find, threefold, fourfold, eightfold, sixfold symmetry, but you won't tend to find fivefold symmetry. That's something more characteristic of what we see expressed in life, is fivefold symmetry. And you find it in those two solids that are duals of each other. Where does Earth fall within his system of the Mysterium Cosmographicum? It's right between, it's nested between outside of the icosahedron and under the dodecahedron. It's found between the two. That's where he locates the orbit of the Earth. The fact that Earth is also the place where you find the expression most, at least viscerally, of life within our solar system is probably not detached from that existence of the golden section expressing itself there, right? It doesn't mean that it's not there elsewhere, but the fact that it's most obvious here also would shape how we would look at, when we have things like the Kepler telescope, trying to figure out, because we started seeing evidence of these different thousands of planetary bodies in other star systems. People are trying to deduce, well, which ones are in the sweet spot, and they're kind of guessing. They're not using a principled technique. But what you might want to do if you were a Keplerian astronomer or astrobiologist, trying to figure out where would you put your resources for, let's say, sending probes, which is going to take a long time. You might want to zero in on those star systems that happen to have a configuration that showcases the golden section in a certain place, and seeing if planets exist in those areas. And then if you do that, you might increase your hit ratio of finding a place that has, more rich life than, some place that doesn't. All that to say, is space dead, right? Is there such a thing as a planet or matter or space that doesn't have life? Well, from the Kepler view, not at all, right? The galaxies themselves seem to be organized in a form of golden section ratio as well, with spiral fractal patterns. So we seem to see evidence of this on the big, on the small. Question is, what is the perfection of its expression, right? Within a process, without assuming that it doesn't exist anywhere.
The mind of God.
Well, that's, I think, a good rational. For me, that I find very satisfying, is that the degree to which we participate more or less, maybe in God, or the mind of God, that's at the heart of creation. For me, that's a metaphysically satisfying place where I tend to go for my final causality, beyond the mechanical causality. But that's open for discussion, right? I mean, that's a whole. We could take time talking about that, and that could go on for a while. But personally, that resonates with me. Huh?
Couple of thousand years at least.
Or sooner, but still, definitely, it's a rich conversation. Yeah.
An ongoing one.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the Babylon Bee headline, though, of the atheist who is buying the Powerball ticket thinks he might have a chance of winning in spite of the low chance of God existing. So
you're gonna send me that. That's funny.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
Yeah. And
it's the whole idea of Darwin. Well, if the Earth has existed forever, well, maybe just if you have forever as your time, then anything can happen. And so statistically, maybe if you record enough audio of Times Square, you may by some chance get Mozart's 41st symphony.
Yeah.
I mean, it could happen, but what are the chances of that happening?
Yeah,
is the
exactly.
question.
I
Yeah.
heard it said, anything is possible. Is it probable?
Well,
Which
but
is-
then there's then, to be honest, if we're honest with ourselves, there's things that are impossible too.
Yeah,
I
but
mean-
is it probable? You know, no, anything, I think anything you think is possible if you really put your mind to it. It's
Yeah,
just,
but what about
can
me?
we do it?
What if
in
I
our
throw
time
an
frame?
absurd one at you? I'll just stretch it to the absurd, right? Like, will I
Throw a third
possible
arm.
for me to turn into a purple hippopotamus
Yeah.
at any point in time in the next 5 minutes? Is that a possibility?
I would say no.
I would say that, yeah, okay. I'm stretching it to the realm of the absurd a bit there, but just to put some boundary conditions on the possible and the impossible.
I'm
Or
not
can you
smart
make
enough.
here's a good one. Is it possible to create a polygon that has less than a straight-sided polygon that has less than 3 sides? Right?
Mm.
Is that possible?
As far as I know, the answer is no.
Yeah.
Or can you intersect 4 lines so that they're all perpendicular to each other?
Hold on, short circuit. Can you
4
intersect 4 lines?
4 lines.
4 lines.
Yeah.
4 lines intersecting
Those are 2
all so
lines.
that they're all perpendicular to each other. And
Like,
so
so I got one there and one there.
No,
That's
those are
2.
2 lines. Those are 2 lines.
those are 2 lines.
Yeah.
Then you put a third one there. It's like a 3-dimensional. Where do you put the 4th one? So that it's all
Oh, I see. That's
they're
good.
all perpendicular to each other.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. It's good. We should find more examples of this. Hey, how about that as homework? We never do homework, but let's try to find some examples of things that are impossible like that for next week.
Sure. Jolie is just asking also for you to recommend a Kepler source material.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, we have on the Rising Tide Foundation links to all of Kepler's writings, and I will send them to you. Yeah, they're great. Some a little challenging, but great. And Rick has been sharing really, really rich thoughts in the chat box. And Rick, I'm so sorry that I didn't read them, but they're great. Well,
You mean read them out loud? You read them, but you didn't.
I read them to and kept them selfishly to myself. Yeah. But yeah, we'll have to. Hey, Rick, for next week, will you be able to have a microphone or just the written word?
I think he stepped away.
Okay. Slow connection. I understand. Okay, written word it is. And Jolie, send me an email because I don't have your email offhand, and then that way I'll send you the Kepler links as well. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
All right, guys. It was a fun night. Always love these Wednesdays, and I think next Sunday, Cynthia, it's your part 3 of the C.S. Lewis trilogy, right? Wrapping up.
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, so that's Father's Day. Guys, take care all. Have a great night. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.